On a March evening in 1974, a man stepped into the middle of the mall in central London, forced a royal car to a stop, and opened fire. He had already shot a chauffeur, a journalist, and a police officer before he wrenched open the rear door, pointed his gun at the 23-year-old woman inside, and told her she was coming with him. He had a ransom plan worked out. He had handcuffs in his pocket and tranquilizers in his car. He had picked his target with care because she was the only daughter of the Queen of England, and in his arithmetic that made her a soft thing, a decorative thing, the sort of person who would scream and comply. What he had not accounted for was the woman herself. She looked at the loaded pistol, looked at the man holding it, and according to the account she gave afterward, she told him to get lost in language, a little stronger than that. Then she refused to move. For the next several minutes, while wounded men lay bleeding on the pavement around her car, Princess sat in the back seat and argued with her own kidnapper. She later described the whole experience as mostly very irritating. This is the part nobody tells you about the second child of Queen Elizabeth II. Everyone remembers Charles. Everyone remembers Diana in the tunnel, and the dress and the panorama interview. Almost nobody remembers that the single most unbreakable human being the modern monarchy ever produced spent 40 years being filed away as a footnote, and that the palace, for reasons of its own, was perfectly content to keep her there. Hi! Today I want to cover a request that has been sitting in my list for the better part of a year because she does not fit the format the rest of these stories run on. There is no Paris tunnel here. There is no abdication, no Netflix deal, no tell-all. There is something stranger, which is a member of the House of Windsor who was demonstrably the best at the actual job, and who the institution decided, very deliberately, not to sell to you. So settle in. Let me be honest about what I mean by darkest secret, because I am not about to pretend I have unearthed a body in the cellar at Gatcombe Park. The secret here is not a crime. The secret is structural, and in some ways it is worse because a crime at least gets a trial. The secret is that the most capable, most reliable, least vain person in the family was systematically kept in the wings for 4 decades while the institution poured its energy into the heir who could not hold a marriage together, and the daughter-in-law it could not control. The press wanted glamour and scandal. The palace wanted figureheads who would behave. Anne offered neither, and so the machine that runs on spectacle simply looked past her year after year, while she did more of the work than almost anyone else under that roof. The cover-up, if you want to call it that, was a cover-up of competence, and it lasted, conservatively, about 40 years. Start with the birth, because the slight begins before she could walk. Anne Elizabeth Alice Louise was born at Clarence House in London on the 15th of August 1950 during the reign of her grandfather, King George VI. Her mother was not yet queen. Her brother Charles had arrived 2 years earlier and was already, by the cold logic of the Constitution, the more important child. That part is not unusual. Here's outrank everyone. What is worth sitting with is what happened underneath Anne over the following decade, because it tells you exactly how the system valued her. When Anne was born, she was third in line to the throne. Then her mother became queen, Charles became heir, and Anne settled in behind him at second. Reasonable enough. But in 1960, her brother Andrew was born, and Anne moved down a place. In 1964, her brother Edward arrived, and she moved down again. She had done nothing. She had committed no error of conduct or character. She was simply a girl, and under the rule of male preference primogeniture that governed the succession until 2013, every brother born after her, regardless of age, leapfrogged straight over her head. A baby in a crib outranked a teenager who could already ride at competition level, purely on the grounds of sex. Nobody at the palace flagged this as an injustice at the time, because at the time it was not regarded as one. It was just the water everybody swam in. But it is the founding fact of Anne's public life, and you cannot understand the next 40 years without it. The family's whole apparatus told her, from infancy, that her value was capped by an accident of biology, and that no amount of effort on her part would ever move the ceiling. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Here is the bitter punchline to that, decades in the making. In 2013, Parliament passed the Succession to the Crown Act, which finally abolished male preference primogeniture and put all sons and daughters on an equal footing. Britain had decided at last that a princess should not be vaulted over by her younger brothers simply for being a woman. But the reform was not retroactive. It applied only to those born after late 2011. So Anne, the living, breathing person the rule had actually wronged, got nothing from the correction. She remained, and remains to this day, parked below her younger brothers Andrew and Edward in the line of succession. The very leapfrogging the new law was written to prevent, preserved in her case like a fly in amber. She has spent her life sliding ever further down the list, as nieces, nephews, and their children were born ahead of her, until she now sits somewhere around 17th, a former Olympic athlete and the hardest working member of the family, ranked below toddlers. She has never once complained about it in public. That too is the point. So she went looking for a contest the rules could not rig against her. She found horses. Anne was sent to Benenden, a girls' boarding school in Kent, which already set her apart, because royal daughters of the previous generation had mostly been educated at home by governesses, the way her own grandmother's generation had been. By her teens, she was a serious rider, and not in the decorative way royals are usually serious about anything. She trained. She competed in open events against civilians and against men, because three-day eventing is one of the few elite sports where the sexes compete directly, on equal terms, for the same medals. There is no allowance made for a princess. The horse does not know your title, and the cross-country course does not care who your mother is. In 1971, at the age of 21, Anne won the individual title at the European Eventing Championships at Burghley. This was not a ribbon handed to a royal at a county fair to keep her happy. It was a continental championship won on merit against the best riders in Europe. The British public, who had no particular reason to like a member of the royal family who came across as cool and unsmiling in photographs, responded by voting her BBC Sports Personality of the Year. She remains one of only 2 royals ever to win that award, the other being her own daughter, decades later. For a brief window in the early 1970s, Anne was famous for something she had actually done with her own hands and nerve, rather than for the circumstances of her birth. It is the one period of her life when the achievement outran the title. It is worth being clear about what eventing actually is, because the word sport flattens it. The 3-day event combines dressage, a brutal cross-country phase over fixed solid obstacles, and show jumping, and the cross-country is genuinely dangerous. Riders are killed in it, horses are killed in it. The fences do not give way when you hit them, and a fall at speed over a solid jump can break a neck. This is the discipline Anne chose, the one with the broken bones and the real risk, rather than some sanitized exhibition arranged to flatter her. She came back in 1975 and won 2 silver medals at the European Championships in Germany, individual and team. She was not a royal dabbling in horses for a photo opportunity. She was a competitive athlete operating at the top of a hard sport in an era when the rest of her family's public function was, by any honest measure, mostly standing still and being looked at. She qualified for the British team and was set to ride at the 1972 Olympics in Munich, then had to withdraw because of trouble with her horse. 4 years later, she made it. At the 1976 Montreal Games, she rode in the 3-day event as a member of the British equestrian team on a horse named Goodwill that belonged to her mother. She became the first member of the British royal family ever to compete at an Olympic Games. The competition itself did not go to plan. She took a heavy fall on the cross-country phase, suffered a concussion, got back on the horse, and finished the course with, by her own later admission, very little memory of having done so. That detail is going to start sounding familiar by the end of this, because getting knocked half senseless by a horse and carrying on regardless turns out to be a recurring theme in this woman's biography, right up into her 70s. That same year, 1976, the Queen bought Anne a wedding present, a country estate called Gatcombe Park in Gloucestershire. It became the center of her life and remains so. Anne is, by every account of the people who know her, happiest there, in boots, dealing with horses and farm matters, far from a camera. The estate would later host a major international eventing festival for decades. The picture worth holding is of a woman who, given the choice between a London life of receptions and a muddy field in Gloucestershire, picked the field every time and was not pretending. The countrywoman was the real one. The princess was the costume she put on to go to work. Hold that image. A young woman, concussed, climbing back onto a horse to finish a course she will not be able to remember, in front of the cameras of the world, representing a country that placed her below her infant brothers in the line of succession. That is the person we are dealing with. Now watch what the family did with her. In 1973, between the European title and the Olympics, Anne married. The man was Captain Mark Phillips, an army officer and a fellow event writer, which is how they had met. The wedding took place at Westminster Abbey on the 14th of November 1973, and the BBC broadcast it to an audience estimated in the hundreds of millions worldwide. The press did what the British press always does to a royal wedding, which is to inflate it into a fairy tale, regardless of the available evidence. Two young, attractive, horse-mad people in a famous old church. The story practically wrote itself, and a great many people wrote it. The reality underneath was thinner. Anne and Phillips shared horses and not a great deal else, by most later accounts, and the gloss the cameras put on the day in 1973 papered over a match that was companionable rather than passionate, none of which mattered to the coverage. Her brother Charles was reportedly unimpressed with the new brother-in-law, privately called Phillips by the nickname Captain Fog, on the grounds that he found the man dim and damp. Whether that was fair to Phillips is another matter, and the man kept his dignity through everything that came afterward. But it tells you the marriage did not arrive wrapped in family enthusiasm so much as quietly tolerated. Phillips was offered an earldom by the Queen so that any children would carry a title, and he turned it down, which is a small detail that tells you something about both of them. They wanted to be left alone. They did not get to be. 4 months into the marriage came the night on the Mall, and since it is the single most extraordinary thing that ever happened to a living member of the royal family, it deserves to be told in full, rather than as the throwaway anecdote it usually gets reduced to. The date was the 20th of March, 1974. Anne and Mark Phillips were being driven back to Buckingham Palace after a charity film's screening, in a chauffeured car, with a single protection officer aboard, a man named Jim Beaton. As the car came up the Mall, a white Ford Escort swerved in front of it and forced it to stop. The driver of the Escort was a man named Ian Ball, 26 years old, unemployed, and, as the courts would later determine, severely mentally ill. He got out of his car carrying 2 pistols. Beaton, the bodyguard, got out to confront him and was shot in the shoulder almost immediately. He tried to return fire, missed, and then his own weapon jammed. Ball moved to the rear door of the royal car and pulled it open. The chauffeur, Alexander Calendar, tried to intervene and was shot in the chest. A passing journalist named Brian McConnell, who happened to be in a taxi behind the scene, got out and walked toward the gunman to try to talk him down, and was shot for his trouble. A police constable named Michael Hills arrived, radioed for help, and was also shot. 4 men, in a matter of minutes, on a public street a few hundred yards from the front of Buckingham Palace. Inside the car, Ball had the door open and his gun on the princess. He told her he wanted her to come with him. He said he intended to hold her for a ransom of £2 million. Money, he claimed. In the rambling logic that came out later, he meant to donate to the National Health Service. He had a typed ransom note in his pocket addressed to the Queen. He had 2 pairs of handcuffs. He had a bottle of Valium. He had thought about this for a long time and had planned it down to the demand that the Queen herself sign the relevant paperwork to prove the money was real. What he got was a 23-year-old who would not budge. He reached in and took hold of her arm to drag her out, and Anne's response, as she reported it afterward, was a flat refusal phrased in the bluntest possible terms. There is a tug-of-war across the back seat, with Ball pulling on one of her arms and Mark Phillips holding on to the other, and at one point Anne's dress tears. She does not panic. She does not scream for help. She keeps the man talking, keeps refusing, and by her own later account, found the entire negotiation chiefly annoying because the gunman would not listen to reason and she had places to be. The thing that ended it was not the protection officer and not the police. It was a passerby. A former heavyweight boxer named Ronnie Russell, who was in the area, walked up and punched Ian Ball hard in the back of the head. Then again, which gave the recovering beaten and the arriving officers the opening they needed. Ball ran, was chased, was tackled, and was arrested. He pleaded guilty later that year and was detained without limit of time under the Mental Health Act. He spent decades in Broadmoor, the high-security psychiatric hospital, and was released only in 2019. In interviews given after his release, by then an old man, he maintained that he was innocent and sane, offering the explanation that he had believed there was no gunpowder in the bullets, and that the woman in the car had been swapped for a body double. 4 men were shot. He has a self-published book about it. I include this only so you understand the caliber of person the princess was calmly facing down, and how little it rattled her. All 4 men who were shot survived. Jim Beaton, the bodyguard who put his own body between the gunman and the princess and took 3 bullets doing it, was awarded the George Cross, the highest civilian award for gallantry in the country. Ronnie Russell, the boxer, received the George Medal. The Queen, it is said, handed Russell his medal and told him quietly that it was from her as a mother and not just as a monarch, which is about as close to raw feeling as that particular woman ever got in public. And the father of the intended victim, Prince Philip, surveyed the wreckage of the plot and produced the line that the whole family seems to have privately agreed was the only sane summary of it. If the man had actually succeeded in abducting Anne, Philip observed, she would have given him a hell of a time in captivity. He meant it as a joke. He was also almost certainly correct. The image of Ian Ball trying to manage a hostage who regarded the entire kidnapping as an imposition on her evening has a certain dark comedy to it that even the people closest to the event could not resist. The attempt on the mall changed how the British monarchy is guarded to this day. The protection that existed in 1974 was, by the later testimony of the officers involved, almost laughably thin. One armed man with a jamming pistol against a determined attacker on an open road. Everything that came afterward, the heavier security details, the better weapons, the planning around royal movements, traces back in part to the night a lone gunman got within arm's reach of the Queen's daughter and was stopped mostly by a journalist with no weapon and a boxer who happened to be walking past. It is the closest anyone has ever come to abducting a member of the royal family, and the person at the center of it treated it, then and forever after, as a story she would rather not have to keep retelling. Here is what I find revealing about the whole episode, beyond the obvious courage of it. In almost any other family, surviving an armed kidnapping at 23 would become the defining fact of your public identity. It would be the first line of every profile. With Anne, it slid quietly into the file marked colorful incidents and stayed there. The institution noted her composure, adjusted its security arrangements, and moved on. There was no campaign to build her up as the nation's plucky survivor, no soft focus interviews about her brush with death. She would not have cooperated with one if there had been. But the silence also suited the machine, which had already decided what Anne was for, and bravery on a London street was not on the list. If you are finding this as strange as I did when I started pulling the thread, the gap between what this woman did and what the public was ever told about her, then do me a favor and subscribe, because the back half of this is where the pattern really shows itself. We have covered the kidnapping. Now we get to the part that actually explains the title, which is the 40 years of work nobody clapped for. What she was for in the official conception was work. And to be fair to the family, they pointed her at it early, and she took to it. She had carried out her first solo public engagement in 1969, at the age of 18, opening a training center in Shropshire. In 1970, at 19, she became president of Save the Children, a role she did not treat as a sash to wear for photographs. She learned the organization, traveled for it constantly, went to places that did not photograph well, and stayed at it for over half a century. That presidency is one of the longest and most substantive associations between a royal and a charity in the modern era, and it generated almost none of the coverage that a fraction of the effort would have generated for a more glamorous royal. And the style of it matters as much as the length. Anne does not do the celebrity model of charity, the one where a famous person lends a face to a cause, poses with a sick child for a magazine, and flies home. She does the opposite. She goes to the refugee camps and the famine zones and the unglamorous field projects, asks pointed questions, expects competent answers, and has no patience for being managed or fussed over. People who have worked with her describe a president who actually reads the briefing papers, who knows the difference between a program that works and a program that photographs well, and who would rather be useful than be seen. She has visited some of the poorest and most dangerous corners of the world on this charity's behalf, repeatedly over 50 years, in conditions that no soft-focus royal documentary would ever dwell on, because the footage is not pretty, and the princess is not weeping. She is asking why the water pump is broken. The work is real, and it is enormous, and it is almost entirely invisible to the public conversation about the monarchy, which is exactly the pattern we keep running into. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. This is the engine room of The Secret. While the public conversation about the monarchy in the 1970s and 1980s was consumed by Charles and his search for a wife, and then by Charles and Diana and the slow public detonation of that marriage, Anne was quietly turning herself into the hardest working member of the family. A title she would hold, by the raw count of official engagements, for years on end. She was not doing it to win the title. She was doing it because the work needed doing, and she was constitutionally incapable of doing it badly, or doing it for show. The press, which had a fairy tale, and then a tragedy to cover in the form of her brother's marriage, had no use for a woman who turned up, did the job, declined to emote, and went home. So they left her alone, which I suspect is exactly what she wanted, and which also happens to be how you bury your best asset in plain sight for a generation. Her own marriage, meanwhile, was quietly coming apart, and the contrast in how she handled its collapse against how the rest of the family handled theirs is the whole argument of this story compressed into a few years. By the late 1980s, Anne and Mark Phillips were living increasingly separate lives. Both were later reported to have formed other attachments. In 1989, the press obtained the existence of a set of private letters written to Anne by a serving naval officer named Commander Timothy Lawrence, who had been an equerry to the Queen since 1986, which is to say he worked inside the palace and had come to know the family well. The letters were stolen and sent to the Sun newspaper. To its considerable surprise, the Sun chose not to publish them and instead handed them to the police, and Buckingham Palace issued a short, controlled statement confirming the letters were genuine, that they had been written to the princess by a friend, that they had been stolen, and that the theft was a police matter. The statement said nothing about the contents and did not need to. The public could do the arithmetic. Watch the technique there, because it is the same instinct for narrative control that runs through every royal story I have ever covered on this channel. The palace did not deny, it did not dramatize. It confirmed the bare minimum, framed the matter as a crime committed against the princess, rather than a scandal committed by her, and starved the story of the oxygen it needed to burn. Compare that to the open warfare of leaks and briefings and competing tell-all books that would define the breakdown of the Wales marriage in the same period. Anne's marital crisis was handled like a controlled demolition. Her brother's was handled like an arson with witnesses. The Phillips marriage ended properly soon after. There was a further blow to it when a separate matter surfaced, a claim that Mark Phillips had fathered a child during an affair. A daughter whose paternity became the subject of legal proceedings around 1991. Anne and Phillips separated in 1989 and divorced on the 23rd of April, 1992. They did it with a minimum of public bloodletting, and they remained civil enough afterward to co-parent and to keep showing up at the same equestrian events without turning them into theater. Phillips had never sought to cash in, and Anne had never sought sympathy. Two people who had married for companionship and run out of it, dissolving the arrangement like adults. The year 1992, you may recall, was the one the Queen herself described in a speech as her annus horribilis, her horrible year. It earned the name. Anne's divorce came in April. Andrew separated from Sarah Ferguson in March, with photographs of the Duchess and a financial advisor splashed across the tabloids that summer. In November, Windsor Castle caught fire, and a chunk of it burned. And in December, Charles and Diana formally separated, ending years of pretense. The House of Windsor spent 1992 coming apart at nearly every seam, in public, in the most humiliating sequence of events the family had endured since the abdication. And in the middle of all that, on the 12th of December 1992, just days after the Charles and Diana separation was announced, Anne quietly got married again. Her second husband was Timothy Lawrence, the same naval officer whose letters had surfaced 3 years earlier. The wedding was about as far from Westminster Abbey in 1973 as it is possible to get. It was held at Crathie Kirk, the small parish church near Balmoral in Scotland, in a private ceremony with a handful of family present. The location was not an accident. Anne was a divorced woman, and at that time the Church of England would not conduct the marriage of a divorced person whose former spouse was still living. The Church of Scotland would. So she married in Scotland, in a small church, in a white suit with flowers in her hair, with her children Peter and Zara in attendance, and almost no fuss whatsoever. Think about the timing of that. The entire institution she belonged to was, in that exact month, the laughingstock of the world's press. Her older brother's marriage had just been declared over in front of everyone, and Anne's response to the family's worst year was to slip away to a Scottish kirk and rebuild her own life with the minimum of spectacle, in a manner so unflashy that it barely registered in the wreckage of the bigger stories around it. She has been married to Lawrence ever since, more than 30 years, with a stability that none of her 3 siblings managed in their first attempts, and she did it without a single soft-focus magazine spread to launder the narrative. She simply solved the problem and moved on, the way she had finished the cross-country course in 1976, the way she had refused to get out of the car in 1974. Sit with the comparison a moment longer, because it is the cleanest illustration of the whole argument. 3 of the Queen's 4 children saw their first marriages collapse, and the manner of each collapse tells you who they were. Charles and Diana's ended in open warfare, 2 camps briefing rival journalists, 2 competing television confessions, a war for public sympathy that scorched the entire institution and arguably never stopped. Andrew and Sarah's ended in farce, with the tabloids running long-lens photographs that no amount of palace management could spin away. Anne's ended in a 1-paragraph statement and a quiet remarriage in a Scottish village church. Same family, same era, same pressures, 3 completely different temperaments under the strain. And the one who came out of it with her dignity fully intact, the one who handled the hardest personal failure a public figure can face, with the least drama and the most grace, was the one the public had been trained to think of as the cold and difficult one. The fairy tale and the catastrophe got the cameras, the competent divorce got a shrug. There is something almost perfectly unfair about that, and it is the shape of her entire life in miniature. There was a recognition of her, of a sort, in 1987, when the Queen conferred on her the title of Princess Royal, a title traditionally held by the eldest daughter of the monarch, and one that had been vacant since the death of the previous holder. It is an honor, and Anne carries it, but notice what kind of honor it is. It is not a step up the line of succession, which the rules of the day would never have permitted. It is a courtesy title, a way of marking the eldest daughter without altering anything material about her standing. She kept doing the work either way, and the work is the thing. Let me put some numbers on it, because the numbers are the closest thing this story has to a smoking gun. Anne is, by the dull and unglamorous metric of official engagements carried out, repeatedly the busiest working royal in the family. In recent years, she has topped the annual count again and again, sometimes carrying out more than 200 official duties in a single year. And in earlier decades, the figure ran higher still, with reports of around 600 engagements in a year at her peak. She is patron or president of several hundred organizations. She has held the Save the Children presidency since the year before England won, lost, and stopped caring about most of the things that have happened in living memory. In the summer of 2024, at the age of 73, Anne was out walking on her estate when she was struck, most likely kicked, by a horse. She suffered a concussion and head injuries serious enough to put her in hospital for several days and to force her to cancel a run of engagements. She recovered. And by the end of that year, despite the hospitalization, despite the lost weeks, despite being in her mid-70s and having a head injury, she once again finished at or near the top of the family's engagement count. Having spent part of the year standing in for her older brother King Charles while he was being treated for cancer, a concussion from a horse, and back to finish the course. The woman is consistent if she is nothing else. None of this softened her relationship with the press, which stayed adversarial for most of her life, and which she made no effort to mend. The defining public glimpse of that came on the 1st of May 1982, at the badminton horse trials, when Anne, then 31, came off her horse Stevie B at a water jump on the cross-country course. Soaked and furious, hauling herself out of the water, she turned on the photographers swarming to capture her misfortune and told them, in the version that reached the newspapers, to naff off. The phrase entered British folklore as a piece of charming royal bluntness. Years later, the photographers who were actually there cheerfully admitted that naff was a polite substitution they had invented for the much stronger word she had actually used, along with several others. She did not court the cameras, and she did not flatter them. She wore the same clothes for years and never updated the hairstyle, and the tabloids, starved of the glamour and the vulnerability they got in such quantity from elsewhere in the family, mostly settled for calling her cold. Cold was easier to print than capable. She also built a substantial second career that almost nobody outside the world of sport ever credited her with. In 1988, Anne became a member of the International Olympic Committee, one of very few royals to hold that position, and one she earned through her own competitive past rather than her title. She threw herself into it. When London bid to host the 2012 Olympic Games, Anne was central to the campaign, traveling, lobbying, and using her IOC standing to push the British case in a contest London was not favored to win. London won. At the handover ceremony, she carried the Olympic flame in the old marble stadium in Athens, and when the Games came to her own city in 2012, she watched from the stands as her daughter Zara won a silver medal in the same discipline Anne herself had ridden at Montreal 36 years earlier. One writer covering the Games put it plainly that Anne was perhaps the single person most responsible for bringing the Olympics to Britain, and that her role in it was almost completely unheralded and unthanked, because she never asked to be thanked and would have been irritated by the fuss. That sentence could serve as the caption for her entire life. She and Phillips raised them as commoners, as Mr. Phillips and Miss Phillips, free to go to ordinary schools and eventually to take ordinary jobs and compete in sport under their own names without his or her Royal Highness in front of them. Zara went on to win a silver medal at the 2012 Olympics in eventing, the same sport her mother had ridden at Montreal in 1976, and she did it as plain Zara Phillips, an athlete rather than a princess. Anne had spent her whole life being told her value was fixed by an accident of birth, and when she had the chance, she made sure her own children would be measured by what they did instead. You can read that as a quiet, decades-long argument with the institution that raised her, conducted not in interviews, but in the choices she made about her family. I think that is exactly what it was. The version of Anne that her own children describe bears almost no resemblance to the frosty caricature the public was handed. Peter and Zara, given the rare chance to talk about their mother in a birthday documentary, painted a picture of a woman who was demanding but warm, who would, in Peter's words, be the first to bring them back down to earth fairly hard whenever they got above themselves, and who in private, away from the cameras and the strangers, was great fun, the one laughing the loudest in the room. Zara, the Olympic medalist, said simply that if she were going to be a mother, her own mother was the model she would want to copy. None of that ever reached the public image, because warmth shown only to the people you trust does not generate headlines, and Anne extended that trust to a very small circle and to nobody holding a notebook. She had watched what happened to relatives who opened their inner lives to the press. She drew the opposite conclusion and held to it for life. That refusal is the deepest line between Anne and the rest of her generation of royals. The modern monarchy, for better or worse, learned to survive on confession, on the soft interview, the documentary access, the carefully staged glimpse of vulnerability that buys public sympathy. Diana mastered it, Charles tried it, Harry built an entire post-royal career on it, Anne wanted no part of any of it. She gave next to no revealing interviews, authorized no sympathetic biography of her marriage, never once went on television to explain her feelings about her divorce or her kidnapping or her place in the family. She regarded her private life as private, full stop, and she paid the price for that in public affection, because a public that is never let in tends to assume there is nothing inside. There was a great deal inside. She simply decided, early and permanently, that it was none of our business. So where does that leave the question I started with? Where is the darkest secret? The secret is not in a locked archive at the British Museum, the way one of the Mountbatten secrets turned out to be. It is not a fertility test before a wedding or a dowry paid to a foreign palace, the way the truth of the Grace Kelly marriage turned out to be. It is not a Nazi funeral procession quietly cropped out of the family photographs. Anne's secret is more ordinary than any of those, and, in a way, I find more damning, because it implicates everyone, including us. The secret is that the British monarchy spent 40 years sitting on its most effective member and chose, again and again, not to tell you about her, because she did not generate the kind of story the institution and the press had learned to feed on. A woman who survives a kidnapping by being too stubborn to be kidnapped. A woman who finishes an Olympic course she cannot remember. A woman who dissolves her own marriage and rebuilds her life in a tiny Scottish church in the worst week of her family's modern history, with no leaks and no tears for the cameras. A woman who turns up to open the tracing centers and visit the charities and stand in the cold shaking hands 600 times a year for half a century and asks for nothing in return except to be left alone to keep doing it. None of that sells a tabloid. None of that fills a Netflix season. So the spotlight went to the abdications and the divorces and the deaths in tunnels. And Anne worked away in the half-dark, and the family let her. Because a reliable workhorse who never complains is the most convenient thing an institution can possibly own. The cruelty of it is subtle. Nobody locked Anne in a tower. She was given real work, and she did it superbly, and she was, in the dry official accounts, respected. But respect that never becomes recognition is its own kind of erasures, and for most of her life the most famous fact about Anne in the public mind was the naff-off picture from a water jump at badminton. A soaked, scowling princess swearing at photographers. That was the woman the country thought it had. A frosty figure on a horse with a sharp tongue. The actual woman, the one who took the bullets and Valium night in her stride and outworked the entire family for decades and helped drag an Olympic Games to London, was hiding in plain sight the whole time, and almost nobody bothered to look. It took the death of her mother and the rough early years of her brother Rain for the public to start, belatedly, to notice what had been there all along. When the Queen died at Balmoral in September 2022, Anne was the child who was there, at her mother's side in the final hours, in Scotland, away from the cameras, doing the hardest and least photogenic duty a daughter can do. In the days that followed, she accompanied the coffin on its long road journey from Balmoral down through Scotland to Edinburgh and on toward London, standing watch over it across hundreds of miles. She stood vigil beside it with her 3 brothers in Westminster Hall, in her military uniform, head bowed, while the public filed past in silence. People watched her carry out the unshowy, exhausting, necessary work of grief turned to duty, and seemed to realize, as if for the first time, that this was a person of real substance who had been right in front of them for 70 years. The recognition came late, and it came partly because the family had finally run short of the more glamorous figures it had always preferred to put forward. There is a temptation, having laid all this out, to turn it into a tidy moral about an underappreciated woman finally getting her due. And I want to resist it, because Anne herself would find it nauseating, and because it is not quite true. She did not spend 40 years yearning for the recognition she was denied. As far as anyone can tell, she did not want it. The invisibility was not only something done to her, it was also something she chose, a bargain she struck with the institution and the press, in which she traded for the right to be left alone to work and to live in a muddy field in Gloucestershire with her horses. She got the better end of that bargain, by her own reckoning, even if history got the worse one. The secret, then, was a secret kept by mutual agreement. The palace was happy to have a workhorse who never asked for credit. The press was happy to ignore a woman who gave them nothing, and Anne was happy to be ignored. Everyone got what they wanted. The only casualty was the accurate public memory of one of the most formidable people the British monarchy produced in the 20th century. An accurate public memory is not something any of the three parties to that bargain were ever paid to protect. I want to end on the horse, because the horse is the whole thing. In 1976, at the Montreal Olympics, Anne fell, hit her head, lost her memory of the next stretch of the course, got back on, and finished it anyway. In 2024, at the age of 73, she was struck on the head by a horse, hospitalized with a concussion, recovered, and went back to finishing her course, which by then meant standing in for a brother with cancer and topping the family's work rate one more time. 48 years apart, the same woman, doing the same thing. Getting knocked half senseless by an animal that does not care about her title, and carrying on regardless, because the job in front of her still needed doing, and she was not built to stop. A man who hated his work does not do it for 50 years with a concussion. A family that valued its best member properly does not leave her in the wings for 40. Both of those things are true about Princess Anne, and the gap between them is the secret. She was the one who could actually do it. All of it. The courage and the endurance and the duty. And she was the one they never thought to celebrate, and she preferred it that way, and the arrangement suited everyone except, perhaps, the historical record. Whatever the monarchy survives in the century ahead, a fair share of the reason it is still standing at all is a woman. Most people could not pick out of a lineup and could not name a single accomplishment for, who quietly held up her end of it longer and harder than anyone else in the building. Anyway, thanks for hanging out for another one of these. If you have somebody you think the cameras walked past, somebody whose real story got buried under the louder ones, drop the name in the comments. I read them. I keep taking your suggestions from this running list of overlooked and underestimated people you all keep sending me, and this one was overdue. See you next time. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.